Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name's Dana Allen. I'm, among other things, editor of Survival, our bi-monthly journal here. And the occasion of this discussion is actually an article that appears, I wanted to say in the current issue, because I actually thought it was going to be out by now, but the upcoming issue, which should be out in a few days, of which this is a tiny little version of the cover, which is the size of my printer. And the article is South America After Chavez. As a non-expert in Latin America, I suppose one of the questions that people like me sort of wondered watching the phenomena of Hugo Chavez, and then thinking and maybe wondering about it, particularly with that tableau of his funeral, was whether the sort of anti-American, the idea of a leftist populist anti-American coalition that he seemed to represent and aspired to lead, is or is not a serious, whether real or potential factor in international affairs today. And I think one of the virtues of this article is that it doesn't answer that question, but it certainly sheds some interesting light on it. Its author is Antonio Sampaio, who is our research analyst for the Latin American program at the IISS. Before joining our institute, he worked as an editor at the Brazilian television group Globo, and he writes and comments on politics and security of the region, particularly Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. I think you're going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion. Antonio.
Thank you. I was looking very closely. I wrote this article about a month, 2 months ago. Started 2 months ago and finished, I think, about a month or a little less. So I was looking very closely into developments recently in search of updates, and a lot has been going on, but mostly pointing to continued deterioration of the economic conditions in Venezuela and continued polarization of the politics there. Perhaps the most dramatic signal was the fighting that broke out in the National Assembly. But it called my attention, and I think to many of you here, the lack of toilet paper. And suddenly this rather basic item has gathered international repercussion. And I think it tells us a lot about the importance of the economic power and the domestic sphere in Venezuela to the foreign sphere of South America and Latin America in general. And that's because, for those who don't know why I'm citing toilet paper, there's a lack of toilet paper there. And they are importing, I think, 50 million rolls of toilet paper, and the president President Nicolás Maduro has said that blame the media for creating an artificial demand for toilet paper. So, yeah, a rather strange comment for a very basic item of the basket. Economic power was key to sustain the foreign policy of Chavez in the past decade, past 12 years, 14 years. During the Chavez era and to this day, the government kept tight price controls on many products, including toilet paper. And that was based on the significant oil revenues that the country had, on loans from key supporters like China and Russia. The government was able to invest in a vast effort of social programs and conduct a foreign policy based on donations of cheap oil, other forms of aid, and alliances built around oil. After all, crude prices rose 400% between the year of Chavez's inauguration in 1999 until 2008. This increase in revenues, alongside the loans that the government received, allowed Chavez to sustain a very expensive foreign policy and build this alliance that was the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of America. So, and it was an expensive foreign policy. It stretched as far as Iran, which received 20,000 barrels of oil between November 2009 and September 2010. Overall numbers are a bit hard to come by, but according to opposition figures, the total of aids, including gifts and subsidized oil that was sent abroad by Chavez just in 2010 totaled 13 billion and a half dollars. The latest report from the Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLAC, shows an intense program of foreign investment that is part of this foreign policy, mostly through the state oil company PDVSA. So investment abroad by Venezuela grew by more than 3,000% between 2000 and 2012. And during that time, the investment to Venezuela, foreign direct investment, fell by 31%. So this is the economic power that Venezuela had and displayed very, very aggressively. And this investment had a clear geopolitical purpose. It was very clear and very practical geopolitical purpose to carve a leadership position among a loyal, however limited group of ideologically aligned countries. This significant investment had the aim of shoring up the government against external pressure and maximizing the effects of the nationalist and aggressive foreign rhetoric. So protecting the government from the kinds of pressures that were involved in the Bolivar, that were a response to the Bolivarian ideology. When we see that Venezuela was able to build or promote a number of regional initiatives like ALBA and perhaps strongly spearheaded also the CELAC, the Commission for Latin America, that involves the whole of the continent except the US and Canada. And these initiatives were able to rival, at least for some time, the one that was strongly supported by Brazil, which was UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. We can see that these investments really paid off, at least for some time. Venezuela, a country with a weak industrial base, and I forgot to count here, I don't know how long it is. So Venezuela, with this weak economic infrastructure, infrastructure overall, and a limited industrial base of products, was able to build and to claim leadership of a region-wide revolutionary project that gained support. We can say that it was limited support to a number of mostly small countries, but also among many social groups in the continent, social movements, workers' unions. So it was very widespread. And Venezuela and Chavez were the leaders of that and benefited from that leadership. So now I want to return to the domestic basis of this foreign policy and to toilet paper. For the past few years, Chavez's rhetoric and charisma were able to shield his administration from many of the domestic problems of the country. But this is changing recently. We saw, I mentioned Maduro blaming the media for the lack of toilet paper, but it hasn't worked this time, and there are a number of signals pointing to the population no longer accepting the justifications of the government and the conspiracy theories, the blaming on the opposition, the blaming on the US. There was a recent opinion poll that showed that the opposition candidate, Enrique Capriles, was more popular than Nicolás Maduro. I'm not sure if that was the first time that it happened, but it's a significant development. So, of course, not only toilet paper, but 20% of the basic basket of products in Venezuela, the basket of products that are regularly bought by Venezuelans, are lacking in the country's supermarkets, including the ones that are maintained by the government. This crisis of Chavismo, therefore, is deeper and faster than we all expected. I remember the ISS released a strategic comment late last year pointing to food security, inflation, the economic problems affecting the poor sectors of the population that were the basis for Chavez's foreign policy. These all factors that could lead to instability in Venezuela, but the speed of these effects have been greater than many expected. In the October elections, Hugo Chavez defeated the opposition candidate Capriles by an 11 percentage point advantage. 6 months later, his anointed successor, Nicolás Maduro, won with an advantage of 1.5 percentage point, if we believe the National Electoral Council. So that means almost 1 million votes lost in 6 months. So we see that food shortages, a deceleration in economic growth, which is forecast to drop by almost 5 points this year, and persistent inflation are sapping the public's trust in Chavismo as a viable movement after Chavez. And this has profound implications for South America. That is because countries like Bolivia and Ecuador, which were strong allies of Chavez, the strongest in South America, were able in the past to defy their neighbors and foreign investors with guaranteed backing by Chavez, by Caracas. So this decline in the domestic foundations of the foreign policy is changing the political game in the region gradually. To be honest, some dynamics continue remarkably similar. There have been hostile exchanges between Venezuela and Peru, and to some extent with some sectors of the Colombian political scenario in the past few weeks. The anti-American flag continues to be raised very aggressively, but Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador have adjusted their posture towards South America quite significantly recently. We saw that in the past, the inflammatory rhetoric was directed not only against the US, but also against Brazil, the regional powerhouse. The most dramatic example of that was the 2006 nationalization of assets of Petrobras, the Brazilian national oil company. There were troops being sent by Bolivia to the Petrobras infrastructure in Bolivia. And these impose high economic and political costs to the regime in Brasilia, to the government in Brasilia, but also raise fears that among the industrial base in São Paulo, that the very energy security of the country was under threat. This was a very heavy cost to Brazil, and there were many sectors in Brazil that criticized the government for not acting more aggressively. And the hand of Chavez was seen behind the Bolivian nationalization, and more recently in 2011, so a few years after the event, WikiLeaks further gave evidence of this involvement. So the 2006 episode was classic Chavista foreign policy in action. There was a strong nationalist justification based on foreign companies exploring the country's resources without paying due dividend. And also a very clear backing by Caracas. The Venezuelan oil company PDVSA was seen as competing for Petrobras for participation in the Bolivian market. So as Chavez struggled with cancer, more recently, the last phase of his illness last year, we saw a more intense interaction between ALBA countries, especially in South America, and Brazil. In late 2012, Bolivian President Evo Morales went to great lengths to overcome opposition to among indigenous communities to a road project that was linking Brazil to Bolivia. He also accelerated the country's bid to join Mercosur, the common market of the South that was founded by Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. That was shortly after Venezuela joined, and is being closely followed by Ecuador, the other ALBA country in South America in which Rafael Correa, the president, has intensified the bid recently for Mercosur membership, stating that he expects full membership in up to 10 months. Correa's government also appealed in February for Brazilian support by $1 billion in loans from Brazil from the National Development Bank, which ironically was the same institution that it threatened to default in 2008. In Venezuela itself, Chavez, the government recently discovered that China is not the reliable partner that it once seemed. Recent developments in Venezuela, recent comments by Chinese officials point to increasing irritation on the delays in oil infrastructure in the country, in not enough return to the investment of Chinese investment in the country. More recently, that was reinforced by the visit of the Vice President of China to Venezuela, which also showed some pressure on the lack of progress in oil infrastructure there. And we saw Maduro turning increasingly towards Dilma Rousseff, the Brazilian president, even though she adopts a colder approach to the more ideological side of Chavismo, the ideological movement that supported the Chavez movement in Venezuela. Maduro's tone was markedly moderate and calculated during his recent trip that he did last week through Mercosur countries. Instead of the traditional showcases of strong ideological symbology and provocations against the US, we saw him going straight to business. He focused on seeking things from Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, the countries he visited. He secured 700,000 tons of food, and perhaps surprisingly asked for Brazil's help in energy security. I say surprisingly because the president's foreign affairs advisor, Marco Aurelio Garcia, said that a country with so much oil and gas like Venezuela shouldn't need the assistance of Brazil for energy security. But we know, of course, that the problem energy security in Venezuela is about electricity, not lack of oil. And electricity demands infrastructure investment. And also there is an institutional cooperation being forwarded by Brazil recently with the opening in Venezuela of arms of some of its most successful government agencies, such as the Agriculture Agency, Embrapa, and the State Bank, the Caixa Econômica Federal. So we see this Bolivarian chunk of South America moving gradually from a position of nationalist muscle flexing, many times affecting Brazil, to a lobbying, an aggressive lobbying for Mercosur membership and Brazilian support. And this movement is not just economic, it's not just in search of money, but also has a strong political component. ALBA and the Community of Latin American Caribbean States, CELAC, served as tools to display Venezuelan leadership while diluting that of Brazil. These initiatives competed directly, as I said, with UNASUR, the long-standing Brazilian bet to South American integration. But now we see Maduro hinting towards a new political narrative. During his visit, he said that Mercosur's common market aim were reminiscent of the project of Simón Bolívar, the revolutionary leader of Latin America in the 19th century. He also commended President Lula, former President Lula of Brazil, as the only remaining icon of the recent wave of Latin American integration, the others being Néstor Kirchner of Argentina and Chavez of Venezuela. He also boasted that Brazil and Venezuela went from a cold and sometimes tense relationship to being brothers. And this was responded by Brazil with an offer of a strategic relationship. Dilma Rousseff stated that now the two countries had a strategic relationship. We are witnessing a movement towards acceptance of Brazilian influence and leadership in South America, accompanied by an attempt to harmonize Brazil and Mercosur with the revolutionary ideology of the Bolivarian movement. The political narrative of Chavismo, the revolutionary pan-American discourse, is a very strong and crucial aspect of its domestic support. And Maduro's willingness to include Mercosur and Brazil with its center-left government and dubious ideological alignment, into this narrative shows a significant window for political influence by Brazil. So much has been said about the strong links between Venezuela and China, but there's a sense that Brazil is the only one with a strategic commitment to Venezuelan and regional stability. While the Venezuelan government continues to appeal for Chinese cash, Brazil is seen as a safer bet and more willing to commit support in deeper institutional political grounds. Brazil, despite having significantly less economic power than Venezuela, it has shown commitment to the South American project, with Venezuela in it. Also, Brazil has become the only country with enough political and economic clout to influence Venezuela. Its list of potential supporters is not very long, because, as we know, the relations with the Pacific countries, especially Colombia and Peru, recently have been cold. Bolivia also has some tensions with Chile that sometimes erupt in rhetoric. And the anti-American flag has to be sustained for domestic ideological grounds. This new wave of Brazilian influence has not come free to ALBA countries in South America. There was a demand by Brazil. Brazilian officials recently made a series of trips to Venezuela, especially since Chavez's final health deterioration last year. Dilma Rousseff diplomatic pressure on stage and backstage was crucial to Maduro's decision, and this pressure was exerted during a UNASUR meeting in April. It was crucial for Maduro's decision that a recount of the vote should be accepted, a recount of the vote of the April presidential election in Venezuela. Dilma has also distanced herself from Chavismo, making clear that her commitment was to the country, to the state, but during the trip she made to Caracas for Chavez's funeral, Dilma stated that the Brazilian government did not entirely agree with the policies of Chavismo, and she returned to Brasilia the night before the funeral of Chavez, avoiding being seen in the same spotlight with strongly ideological demonstrations and also some international pariahs like Iranian Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran. So as consequence of this changing political relationship, the dynamics of economic relations are also changing. The renewal of the large-scale development loans from Brazil to Ecuador last year, in which Brazil agreed to finance some energy infrastructure projects in Ecuador, 3 years after a very important Brazilian construction company, Odebrecht, was kicked out of the country, and the president threatened to default the National Development Bank of Brazil. Brazil agreed to return this large-scale investment last year. That came 3 years after the developments in Ecuador, and only after Korea's government publicly guaranteed the safety of investments to Brazil. As we saw recently, these influences not always successful. The calls from Brazilian officials for moderation and reaching out to the opposition in Venezuela do not exactly result in a significant change in domestic politics or in the domestic approach to domestic politics by Maduro. However, the result is likely to be different in key aspects of foreign policy. The deepening involvement and reliance on Brazil and Mercosur will create pressure for militant left-wing governments such as Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela to tone down their inflammatory and nationalist policies. It is now more difficult to see provocative gestures towards Brazil. Brazil has now more leverage to exert over these countries. And it is more difficult to see provocative gestures as the nationalization of energy infrastructure in Bolivia in 2006. Brazil is the main stakeholder in the transition. It has invested politically, it has invested economically. It also has largest potential to gain from a successful realignment. The decline of this militant strand of foreign policy, if it is continued, reduces the costs and risks of volatile state posturing in these countries, which has affected Brazil in the past. For example, during the Colombia-Venezuela escalation in 2008 and 2009, that threatened the region's position and claim for being peaceful and solving its problems by itself without U.S. intervention. It also increases Brazil's deterrent against nationalizations. But a more long-term strategic shift is a reduced competition to Brazil's project of South America unity, linked to its search to more influence in world affairs, because integration in South America under Brazilian leadership is seen as important, although not entirely necessary, to more Brazilian influence in world affairs and its emerging power status. While its position in South America was never easily absorbed by rising Pacific countries, its sponsorship of UNASUR has gained traction recently. With the reduced capacity of Venezuela to stretch its resources into foreign policy, we see fractures in this left-wing alliance that was created during the past 14 years. Venezuela is gradually losing its position as a pole of attraction distinctively different from its neighbors. So a pole of a geopolitical alliance that was different from the ones sponsored by Brazil and the ones sponsored by the Pacific countries. Domestic developments in Venezuela will be crucial to determine the speed of this transition and how intense and painful the adjustments there will be. But the past few weeks and months have already showed that there is a severe deterioration going on in Venezuela. And as a result of that, new types of relationships are being considered, new models are being considered. Brazilian foreign policy has acquired greater voice and greater responsibility, and it is definitely the one that has the largest stake in this transition process. So I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Antonio. Thank you very much. I think you've, as you did in the article, given all the complications, you've nonetheless told a fairly clear story. Of I guess, Chavismo sort of running out of steam and in various ways needing to accommodate itself to a more pragmatic sort of Brazilian way of looking at things. But I wonder if I could just push you on that and ask whether nonetheless, sort of what endures or what is likely to endure of the concerns and the real problems and the ideology that animated Chavismo. You say Brazil has become more explicit in distancing itself from Chavismo, but nonetheless, is there something that, in aspiring to leadership, Brazil needs to take account of?
Yeah, Brazil has been pressed for the recently for the developments in Venezuela that point to problems in the democratic process in Venezuela. Perhaps Brazil wasn't as willing to speak out about domestic developments. It has done in a kind of bilateral way during the UNASUR meeting in April. It has done that in backstage. It has done that in the kind of diplomatic soft power approach that Brazil has traditionally conducted itself or its foreign policy. So there were some pressures by the Brazilian media and by regional observers for stronger Brazilian voice in pointing towards more respect for the opposition, freedom of expression in Venezuela, the freedom for the press. But I think Brazil has showed that it has a gradual approach. It sees that at the same time that Venezuela is facing gradual instability, a gradual road towards instability, it also sees that it needs to act cautiously. It knows that the Chavismo has a strong grip in power, so it can't go too far into undermining that. So for now, Brazil's bet is on the continuation of Chavismo and a gradual shift in domestic politics rather than a more or a faster and more intense domestic shift or transition. So Brazil has been clear in support in accepting the results of the latest elections, as have most of the UNASUR countries. And I think the region sees that Chavismo has deep roots in the institutional tissue of the country, and should not be taken too quickly. So yeah.
Thank you, Nigel Inkster.
Thanks, Nigel Inkster, Transnational Threats, Political Risk here at IISS. Antonio, thank you very much for that very comprehensive analysis. The one country you didn't mention in Latin America, which I think is perhaps of interest, is Cuba, simply because while Hugo Chavez was alive, it was widely known throughout Latin America that Fidel Castro was the only Latin America leader to whom Chavez paid any attention or to whom he listened. Yeah. And we have witnessed over the last dozen or so years a very significant penetration by Cuba of particularly Venezuela's security organs, the intelligence service, and so on, and become pretty much a wholly owned subsidiary of the Cuban state. Where does this transition leave the relationship with Cuba, and what is your prognosis as to how that relationship might develop?
It's interesting the case of Cuba because the observers here who have been looking to Venezuela more closely in the past few days will know that there was an audio recording released by the opposition in Venezuela that gained widespread repercussion in the region. Basically, Mario Silva, government supporter and presenter of one of the most popular programs in Venezuela, was caught in a very clear audio recording speaking of the internal divisions in the country and speaking that to a representative of the Cuban counterintelligence service, G2. So one thing that, well, the audio recording shows a lot, tells a lot about the internal divisions that have been going on and confirms a lot of what we suspected. But the other thing that I took from that recording is that there is a even deeper involvement with the Cuban intelligence services than I previously imagined. Talks of regular meetings involving Venezuelan officials, Venezuelan institutions, and the Cuban intelligence service. Meetings even with the military sectors of Venezuela in Fuerte Tijuana. So that points to a very strong link with Cuba. But I think the regime in Cuba has identified previously that the Chavismo, even if it survives without Chavez or not, that Venezuela is in a decline of its domestic capabilities. So it has taken some economic measures, some economic liberalization measures. I think they are part of the Cuban attempt to adapt to these new circumstances. But Maduro is linked to one of the other things that one of the other issues among this debate about internal divisions in the Venezuela politics is that Maduro is the leader of, or aligned to that faction of more ideological components of Chavismo, and they are strongly linked to Cuba. So as long as he remains in power, links to Cuba will remain, and we saw that previous to his trip to Mercosur countries, Maduro conducted a meeting of the Petro-Caribe initiative that provides cheap oil to 18 countries in Latin America, and stated very clearly that he wishes to maintain that. So for the domestic political narrative of Chavismo, it is important to maintain the support for the oil initiatives, the support for oil subsidized oil for Cuba, and the ideological and political connection with Cuba. So for now, for the near term, I don't see that being changed. But what we all speculate, I think we're all dancing around here is the fact that the economic adjustments, the economic problems in the country will require some adjustment. And which aspects of the foreign policy, the expensive foreign policy that I've been mentioning, will be adjusted, I think is the crucial question. I don't see Maduro meddling with the oil supplies right now, but in a few years' time, it's a different measures. The situation in Venezuela is very volatile.
Thank you. In the back there.
Christopher Jackson. I work for Johnny Mike Thompson. We're a risk consulting insurance broking company in their energy division. My question is, the Venezuelan state, obviously you depended a large amount under Chavismo on supplying a lot of the population with heavy resources from the state, and by and large that tended to come from PDVSA. Going forward in the short to medium term, if we were to say, probably not unreasonably, that PDVSA continues to deteriorate, or if not sort of flatline in terms of its production and ability to generate revenues, whether that's down to fears of nationalization, underinvestment, or the rise of US shale gas, what other drivers are there within the Venezuelan economy that could come forward and potentially make up some of that shortfall? Are there any? And if they're not, then does that not inherently link almost the success or failure to turn around PDVSA to the success of whether or not Venezuela will collapse into further deterioration and unsettled region, or in fact manage to come through and be stable?
Yeah. Yes. A very important part of the Venezuelan social program, the support building of the Chavista machine was through the off-budget mechanisms that come out of PDVSA. And PDVSA by far is the strongest economic asset of the Venezuelan economy. I think in some parts, in some aspects, we've seen that Mercosur is a bet by the current administration as an alternative to PDVSA. Perhaps an attempt to diversify a little bit its economy through integrating with Mercosur and requiring, for example, Brazilian investment. The fact that Brazil established one of the institutional arms that I mentioned, Embrapa, and the other one that I didn't mention was the IPEA, the Institute of Economic Research. It's a very important think tank in Brazil. So they all established arms in Venezuela. and that is an indication that Brazil is concerned about that and is willing to help Venezuela, and that the government is relying on Brazilian support for that. But having said that, there is no easy way out in the short term. The economic adjustments, there were signs for a few years. As I said, we've published a strategic comment last year pointing to those processes, and the same things continue to this day. So the economic adjustments were needed a few years ago. And so the Venezuelan state is very heavily concentrated in PDVSA. So, and these dynamics that you've identified that might continue in the future, deterioration of the oil infrastructure, PDVSA or oil output in Venezuela being stalled, or these are already happening. So, and that is the whole narrative of the economic fragility in Venezuela. So yes, PDVSA will continue to be a strong indicator of further economic deterioration in Venezuela, and there is no easy way out. As Venezuela becomes more integrated into Mercosur, we could see it absorbed by the supply chain in Venezuela, and perhaps benefiting from that. And also, there were some articles in the international press, although I'm not so sure how sustainable that is, that Venezuela is willing to open up a little bit to the private initiative. For example, during the food shortages, the government wasn't as radical, perhaps, or as aggressive against the Polar food company. So some observers have identified that as an indication towards an opening to the private sector. And we could see, for example, an opening towards foreign investment in oil. So that could be a way out also for the government, but that would require a strong adaptation of its political narrative for the domestic consumption. And it would be interesting to observe that if it really happens.
Yes, you're right there.
Jimena Blanco from Maplecroft, a global risk analytics firm. I wanted to go back to your point about the shift in Brazilian rhetoric and UNASUR calling for the elections results to be reviewed or recounted. And I was wondering, to what degree would you say this is a strategic PR performance playing mainly to domestic Brazilian opposition, which argued that Brazil's response to the Paraguayan removal of President Lugo was, radically different from its response to the electoral, allegations in Venezuela, and Brazil in some way had to realign its position to play to, domestic criticism. But also I wanted to think more about the unity of the UNASUR position because, in a lot of press statements behind the scenes, we know that UNASUR is not as unified as it appears in its public statements. And if we assume that Bolivia and Ecuador will enter Mercosur, do you think that might, in fact, instead of unifying the region economically, it might cause a split with, a larger number of either ALBA or pro-ALBA countries, like for example Argentina, being members of Mercosur, and other more pro-market open economies like Colombia, Peru, Chile, effectively moving away from what's increasingly becoming Mercosur, a more, protecting and closed group of countries.
Yeah. About the electoral, Brazil's response to the electoral processes, yes, Brazil has a pragmatic approach as well, and that is linked to the level of criticism that it received for not pressing more strongly for political changes internally in Venezuela. In the case of Paraguay, when Brazil suspended Paraguay from Mercosur because the president there, Fernando Lugo, was ousted or impeached in a very speedy process. Perhaps there wasn't a sense in Brazil that process was that the exclusion of Paraguay wasn't going to make things worse in the region, wasn't create stability. Whereas in Venezuela, a stronger commitment to Brazil or strong words from Brazil questioning the result of the elections would mean instability in the region. So there is a commitment to stability, and how Brazil conducts this foreign policy towards stability is a gradual process and a pragmatic process of accepting some issues and the others perhaps changing gradually or pressing for gradual change and looking at the long game. So, but there is a pragmatic approach as well as a more perhaps strategic or political commitment to the idea of South America. Regarding the UNASUR, your question was if, the entrance of the more ideological and less and more ideological, perhaps more, in some senses, protectionist economies, the effect of that in Mercosur. Yes, Brazil is leading a current in South America that is preoccupied not only with trade but with what we call here we have this program here in the US as geoeconomic power, and I think the narrative in South America has been strongly connected to that. Brazil wants geoeconomic power, and it wants to develop its industry. Brazil is fully aware, the government is fully aware of the criticism towards and some allegations that it is protectionist, but it hasn't showed any commitment to change that, and that is because it sees as a number one priority its industrial development that involves sometimes protectionist measures towards acquiring a stronger, more sustainable industrial base and economic power. Whereas Mercosur has been expanding, there was a political element to this expansion in which the entrance of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador will create some kind of tension, not some kind of tension, but a lot of tension with the commitment to free trade that was the origin of Mercosur. So yes, Mercosur has changed into, at this stage, a political drive towards acquiring more countries to its initiative. But it is also responsible by Brazil to the Pacific Alliance countries that are forming Chile, Colombia, and Peru, that have a more cohesive approach to trade, a more cohesive approach to economic policies. So there is a political drive towards the expansion of Mercosur, but underlining of that is, I think, when we talk about this polarization between Mercosur-led eastern part of South America and the western bloc of Pacific Alliance, there is this problem of how do we modernize our economies and how do we become modern, powerful economic players. The Pacific Alliance narrative has been very popular in the international press, for example, but when you look at the Colombian press, for example, as I have in recent days, has been very strong on pointing on cogitating the Dutch disease or the results of deindustrialization and some negative aspects of China in Latin America. Whereas in Brazil, there is the criticism towards protectionism. So there is a debate, a very complicated debate going on. And I think perhaps in the future, as Brazil becomes a stronger pole of attraction, if its GDP growth, if it returns to that Brazil of 2008 and 9, when it grew very strongly, perhaps it will become a stronger pole of attraction for these countries, and perhaps we could see a middle ground between Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, where the Pacific Alliance will see that a huge chunk of its neighborhood has turned towards Brazil and will want to move towards that. I think that is the solution that I see to this kind of a debate that is going on. If it doesn't happen, or if it doesn't happen quickly, there will continue to be this kind of economic polarization between East and West, and it's very timely, this discussion, because tomorrow the Pacific Alliance will formalize 90% of free trade. So, and it has become a darling of the international investors, whereas Brazil we see has ceased to be the darling that it was a few years ago. So, yeah, so there is a political element to the expansion of Mercosur and a polarization going on.
Thank you. James Lockhart Smith.
Yeah, James, also from Maplecroft. Jimena asked some of what I was going to ask, but I'll restate it anyway because I think the point's worth pressing. That was a really interesting presentation, and I agreed with a lot of the details of what you said about more Venezuelan weakness. I just wonder if we could perhaps reconsider the extent to which that automatically means, a winning situation for Brazil. You described early on in the presentation ALBA in the previous decade as a very powerful alliance. It was Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador on the side, some Caribbean countries. It was some of the sort of smallest, Venezuela plus some of the smallest and most marginal economies in the region. It gave us all something to write about. But there was a sense in which it was a lot of sound and fury signifying not very much. Contrasting with that, you have Brazil with very, very healthy GDP growth through most of the decade, forming UNASUR really as the pinnacle of its ambitions. What you have now is this sort of rush to Mercosur, with Venezuela and now Ecuador, Bolivia and others all joining a queue to join. As you noted in your previous answer, you also have the fundamental principles of Mercosur integration a little in doubt. They're not allegations of protectionism in Brazil, it is protectionism. It's increasing tariffs, tax breaks for domestic companies, all sorts of things like that. Brazil is pressing forward with an alternative vision of how it wants to develop its industrial base, what it sees as free trade. Putting that together with what's been happening to the Brazilian economy, which you sort of alluded to when you said if we could return to the Brazil of 2008, 2009, what we're seeing now with GDP growth last year of less than 1%, this year probably 2.5%, no more than that. In one sense, it's a bit of a bump in the road. In another, the sort of way in which expansion of household credit and so on drove GDP growth in the past decade, that's definitely run out of steam. There are major structural problems which are not going to be addressed, certainly before 2015 and after the next elections. And I think there's a way in which that might drive a certain sort of inwardness on the part of the current government, less inclination to successfully attempt to deal with what's going on in the immediate neighborhood. And combining that with everybody wanting to join Mercosur, I think it's not the case that this is everybody being drawn into the orbit of Brazil. It's more that a new and more complex situation is developed. It's not actually clear yet how that's going to work out in Brazil, and a lot will depend on what Rousseff is or isn't able to do.
Absolutely. The gain to... Sorry.
I was just going to say, in the interest of time, I would suggest you only respond to anything in that statement you disagree with.
Absolutely. I'll start with some that I agree. It's the gain. So I will immediately disconsider your recommendation. It is by no means an automatic gain. I completely agree with you. But there was an openness towards Brazil and an increase in influence and the stronger sense that Brazil is the player to stabilize these countries and to fill the vacuum that is being left by the decline of Chavista foreign policy. But how Brazil is going to, or how the region or the Brazil-led bloc will conduct that shift will be crucial, because there is a shift towards a more inward-looking bloc. But Brazil's concern right now is forming a political bloc that is able to, in which it is able to be the dominant player, and using that as a leverage for world affairs, for its bid to more influence in world affairs. And Brazil, we saw, for example, Samuel Pinheiro Guimarães, the Mercosur main diplomat in Brazil, released a document a few months or years ago, perhaps last year, saying that Brazil's project in South America has to be through Mercosur. It can't be turning South America into a trade bloc, because right now there is this polarization. There is this very clear difference towards trade and economic policies in the Pacific countries. So what Brazil is doing is expanding as much as it can on a political drive, and then exerting its influence and its foreign policy as much as it can in the region. And at the same time as that, Brazil is strongly, and that is a clear priority for Brazil, strongly pushing for stronger GDP growth. It's doing what it feels it can in the moment. There is a lot of things to be done. But GDP growth is a priority for Brazil. Whether it is conducting that search for GDP growth correctly or not, that is another debate. But there is this sense that industrial development and more protectionist measures for the moment are the priority. So Brazil is not so concerned with integrating itself into the Trans-Pacific Partnership or being left out of the free trade agreements. Its priority is clear. It is towards economic GDP growth, and it sees industrial development with some level of protectionism as the road for now.
Thanks. Yes, right there.
Hi, my name's Madeline Stern. I'm a student of Latin American politics at UCL. I've got two quick questions on bilateral relations. You mentioned that the hand of Chavez was clearly sort of involved in the nationalisations that Bolivia Morales has undertaken. Does that mean that you think that those nationalisations will come to an end now, or that there'll be significantly less of those as a result of Chavez not being around? Presumably Maduro doesn't have that kind of influence, whatever's going on. And my second question is whether we might expect more influence or perhaps more intervention or activity from the US within Venezuela in whatever fashion, business, politics, whatever, as a result of Brazil's growing influence there that you've detailed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll start with the US. Venezuela, as I mentioned, the list of rescuers to Venezuela is not very long. China and Russia continue to be supporters in most occasions, but not all. Whereas we saw some interesting developments, some signals from Venezuela that it wants to come closer to the US in some aspects. And Maduro has said that in the presence of a US diplomat recently. But at the same time, the US is such an important aspect of the political narrative in Venezuela, of the Bolivarian revolutionary narrative internally, that although Maduro is willing to adapt in some points, for example, bringing Brazil and Mercosur into this narrative, into the Simón Bolívar project, I see very difficult. It is very difficult to see how he will be able to get a free pass to get the U.S. into closer relations. So we saw during the instability that followed the death of Chavez and the elections, we saw some of the strongest anti-American measures being adopted, the expelling of U.S. diplomats and a further deterioration of the bilateral diplomatic relations, if that was possible. But so the U.S. It has very weak leverage on Venezuela so far. The nationalization, to the extent that the deterioration in the economic power of Venezuela continues, the backing, the basis for the foreign policy of Venezuela, and strong part of this foreign policy was backing countries that adopted the Bolivarian style nationalizations, will continue. Then we can say that the drivers for nationalizations, especially those affecting or nationalizations or expelling of companies affecting Mercosur countries, will diminish. That is not so clear about the foreign investment in general outside globally. Although we saw both Evo Morales and Correa signaling towards further willingness for investment. For example, Correa recently said that its bid to Mercosur membership was part of it is that it expects to Mercosur to have an agreement with the European Union. That is a strong part of Ecuador's drive towards Mercosur. So that perhaps also signals some openness to foreign investment and foreign trade. But for the moment, I think what is clear is that the leverage of Brazil to press for a scaling down of nationalism and rhetoric is stronger.
Good. We're about out of time. I'm going to take the next two people on my list, and I'm afraid that's going to be it, because there are a couple, with apologies to those I can't get to, and those are, and maybe I'll ask you to ask your questions fairly briefly together. The gentleman right here and the lady right next to you.
Okay. David Mares, University of California, San Diego. You talked about the advantages for Brazil of the current weaknesses in Venezuela, but you might think also about the disadvantages for Brazil of that. If you go to Mercosur, one of the big problems for Mercosur is the Argentine-Brazilian relationship, and precisely over things like industrialization and protectionism. And the Argentine government and economy have been heavily dependent on Venezuelan goodwill. So if we think about Bolivia as well, Ecuador, to what degree does Venezuela's inability to continue to support some of the key people who Brazil would like to bring into their partnership, okay, to what extent does Venezuela's inability to support them actually make it more difficult for Brazil to push forward its South American project, particularly in the face of the Pacific Alliance?
So reserve your answer for just a moment. Final question.
Yeah, I'd just be interested to know.
I'm sorry, can you just identify yourself?
I'm just Irene Hopper from Amnesty. I was just thinking on terms that I've heard about the relationship of Brazil sort of being, in a way, disadvantaged with Venezuela during the Chavez years. But I think also, I'd like to hear your opinion about what positives Brazil attained while Chavez was in power, because whilst the Venezuelan internal economic situation, especially the private sector with Procter & Gamble and so many other companies leaving Venezuela, I think that, in my opinion, the Brazilian industry took great advantage of coming into the domestic market while the domestic one was collapsing. And then also in relation to, for example, things like PDVSA, all the brains we had in PDVSA, Petrobras was very quick to, hey, we got an opportunity here. So I think it's important to see also all the advantages, and I'd like to know which ones, it wasn't just a losing but also a winning situation.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to hear about that
Well,
side.
These are complementary comments, so why don't you wrap up on these?
Yeah. On the positives for Brazil, it was very clear that domestically in Venezuela, Brazil benefited from a stronger presence there with the flight of foreign investment. But we should say also that perhaps in the long game, the strategic game, it was a volatile scenario, and Brazil also had some key moments of difficulties with other countries in South America, and whereas the industrial base in Brazil was able to benefit from increased presence in Venezuela, the government had deep troubles in the past with the nationalizations that affected Brazilian assets in these countries. So Brazil had some economic benefits, but for Brazil's commitment to South America and the South American project, it saw Bolivarianism as a source of instability, as a source of risk. So, yes, you're right. There were some benefits internally in Venezuela for Brazil. On the inability of Venezuela to support Argentina, and that creating, that creates a risk of deterioration of the economic conditions in Argentina. But as I said, I think the adjustment of this foreign policy and the foreign support will be gradual. And we saw that these countries, what I identified in my presentation or in my research, is that Brazil has been willing to fill the vacuum sometimes. It showed its willingness to go back to Ecuador after 3 years in large-scale investment, and is integrating Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela into Mercosur. So an openness and a willingness to fill a vacuum. And as long as Maduro sees the continuation as it can of support for these countries, we could see a gradual transition towards more Brazilian presence and less Venezuelan presence.
Thank you. I had one of the notes for my introduction coming from one of the directors of the IISS was that I might say something about the growing strength and the growing ambitions of IISS work on Latin America. I think I failed to do that, but I didn't need to, because I think Antonio has given us an excellent presentation and led an excellent discussion that highlights it. So please join me in thanking him.